Okay, in the last video, we talked about the heart and the whole cardiovascular system and basic cardiovascular anatomy and physiology. But now let's get down to why you care about this stuff. Remember, all the science is great, especially if you're going to be on Jeopardy, but it really only counts if you know how to apply it. So now we're going to talk about being able to look at a person's heart rate and basic training. So, we already said what heart rate is. What is heart rate? Heart rate is beats per minute. That's easy enough, right? Why is it important? Heart rate is the only practical and objective way to measure exercise intensity. It's the only way of doing it. How else do we measure exercise intensity? Well, we ask them, how are they doing? Rate of perceived exertion. In other words, how much are we getting out of the client, out of the athlete? Well, we either ask them how they're doing or we take their heart rate. Those are the only ways we can actually find out how intense it is to them. What is their body telling us? And guess what? The heart does not lie, as opposed, well, your athletes might. So a couple key terms that I want to go over very quickly with you. Resting heart rate, or RHR. Just like it sounds, that is your heart rate at rest. Now, traditionally, how would you find that? Traditional resting heart rate would be found when you wake up first thing in the morning without an alarm, and the first thing you do is take your heart rate for 60 seconds. You do that 3 days in a row, and you take your average. In about 18 years of training, I've had 0 clients do that. It's not exactly very practical, but it is something, an important number that you do want to try and get to. A lot of people will have their clients come in, and first thing they do is they have them sit down for a couple minutes and then take it. Is it a true resting heart rate? No. In fact, I like to call that the initial pre-workout heart rate. It'll be close to the resting unless they've been stressed out and jacked up on caffeine all day long or something else is going on. But it gives you an idea of what their resting heart rate is. You've got the resting heart rate on one end. Let's look at our little table here. At the other extreme, you've got their maximum heart rate. That is obviously, just like it sounds, the absolute maximum number of beats per minute their heart can put out, right? So you've got the two extremes. The lowest number you're going to get, that's their resting, versus their highest number, the maximum. Well, between their maximum and their resting heart rate, you have what's called heart rate reserve. Okay, so that's kind of that span of anywhere from rest to maximum intensity. That's where you're going to see their heart rate. Now, what we're going to find out is there's different ways of programming for people and being able to say, okay, we want your heart rate in these zones. We want you to monitor your heart rate and tell us when you're in these zones. Sometimes you're going to be based on the maximum, a percent of maximum. Sometimes it's based on a percent of the heart rate reserve. So looking at the heart rate reserve number, just realize all that is their maximum heart rate minus their resting heart rate. That gives you your heart rate reserve. Another little term I want you to think about is target heart rate, exactly what I was implying earlier, okay? Where you're going to be able to set, based on the person's goals and their individual maximum heart rate and resting heart rate, what are their target heart rates. We're also going to see that we can actually base those target heart rates on another factor that we talked about last time, that anaerobic or lactate threshold. So lots of things we're going over right now. Just a couple, once again, these are just key terms to kind of get the conversation started. Max heart rate, resting heart rate reserve, and target heart rate. Got one more term for you, okay? Heart rate recovery. Basically, what is that? That is basically how quickly, it's not really so much the heart rate, but how quickly your heart goes back to resting heart rate after an exercise bout. Now, why is that important? We're going to find out. The more fit a person becomes, the quicker, I should say, the person will go back to their recovery heart rate. They recover quicker. That makes sense. Well, you know what? I'm looking at my little slide of notes here, and I realize I lied to you. I'm going to give you one more term after all. I also want to talk to you about heart rate variability. Now, what is that? Heart rate variability is the variation in the beat-to-beat difference in heart rates. Look at our little graph here with heart rates. Now, you can see there's three little beats there. And if you were just measuring it from the first 2 beats, you'd say, okay, that person is 70 beats per minute. And if you measure it between the second and third, it'd be 76 beats per minute. And the third and fourth, I should say now, 83 beats per minute. So there's a lot of variability in there. Now, obviously, you would not be able to figure out what that is. If you just took their heart rate for 1 minute, you might find that it gave you the heart rate for 1 minute being 76. But how much variation is in there? Now, why is this important? The more fit an individual is, the more heart rate variability they will have. The more variable their heart rate will be, I should say. Now, why would that be? Because their heart and their whole body is so in tune to what's happening within their body, it's like their heart is making little mini finite adjustments as far as how quickly it needs to pump. The way I equate it is like you're driving a fine sports car, a manual transmission sports car through a busy city. You're constantly shifting gears. Not going real fast yet, but you're constantly shifting gears. Well, that's what's happening with your heart. If you're an athlete, you're like a fine-tuned sports car. Your heart's constantly shifting gears in order to make those little adjustments to pump out just the right amount of blood, which means pumping out just the right amount of oxygen your body needs. Now, the less fit the individual, the body's not that tuned in, if you will. It's more like driving an old automatic transmission through the city. It doesn't shift gears well. So there's less variability between the individual heartbeats. Why do you care? Well, once again, heart rate variability is a sign of how fit a person is, but it's also another variable that certain monitors, specifically like polar heart rate monitors, can use to actually determine how fit a person is, and it can actually use it in their training computers for the program design. So it's really an amazing tool that you won't exactly know what their heart rate variability is, but just know that there's technology out there that can use it to your advantage. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about how does the body control that heart rate. Okay, so we're going to talk about control the heart rate from outside the heart. We already talked about how you've got the natural pacemaker in there, that sinoatrial node, that's the pacemaker of the heart. We also talked about, if you remember going back to that nervous system lecture, there was the autonomic nervous system, and that controls the involuntary functions of the body. Well, heart rate would be included there. So you've got those two divisions. Should be review because you've already seen this. You've got the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems, remember? So from outside the heart, you've got the autonomic nervous system with its two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Then you have also got the endocrine system, your hormones that can affect heart rate. So let's talk about those independently here. The parasympathetic nervous system, remember, that's the rest and digest system. So what happens? That actually decreases heart rate, and it also decreases blood pressure and respiration rate, breathing. It increases digestion, and once again, it prepares the body for rest and energy conservation. Now, just because you'll see this term a lot, you'll hear about the vagus nerve, which is a very important parasympathetic nerve that innervates many of the thoracic and abdominal organs. So you'll hear often the term the vagus response, which really means a parasympathetic response or a vagal response. You also hear it called that way too. So when you hear vagal response or vagus response, it's the same as a parasympathetic response. It's that rest and digest, right? So you think decreased heart rate, decreased respiration, and so forth. Now let's look at the other extreme. Let's look at that was the parasympathetic. Now let's look at the sympathetic response. So remember we said that was a fight or flight, right, system. In fact, I mentioned in an earlier video a book by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. He calls this the 4 Fs, the fight, flight, fright, and sex system. Seriously, that's what he calls it. Don't send letters to me, send them to him. Anyways, but that's what it's for, all right? It's getting you ready to fight, getting you ready to flight, get away from something that you don't want to fight with, right? Fright when you're frightened, and yes, sex, all right? This is when this nervous system kicks in. So what happens here? Increase in heart rate, increase blood pressure, increase in breathing rate, all right? Decrease in rate in digestion moves the blood away. And like I already mentioned, in that nervous system, this is basically what happens during exercise. It is a stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, and that is a good thing. Once again, if you don't remember all the reasons why, go back and watch that nervous system video again, all right? So the third way that the heart rate is controlled from outside the heart, that's the endocrine system, all right? So during that sympathetic nervous system response that I just mentioned, certain hormones are released. Specifically, you've got norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and epinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. So you're going to hear those terms a lot. So you've got that hormonal response that will also help increase heart rate. All right. All that I said, we talked about different terms. We talked about how heart rate's controlled, and once again, why exercise is an artificial stimulation of that sympathetic nervous system. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes here. Let's talk about how this all relates to training. Now, remember that when training, all we're doing is adapting the body to a stress. It's your job as the coach and the trainer to determine what type of stress is appropriate for the individual's goals. Right? So if they're an endurance athlete, well, you're going to have to get them ready for an endurance event. You're going to have to train them for that long and low level intensity versus someone that is short and intense. I keep using the other extreme of like a mixed martial arts fighter. Well, they're going to have to do short, intense bursts and still last a 5-minute round. So you're going to have to work multiple energy systems and multiple heart rates, which are going to be higher than you would if you're training for, say, a marathon or a triathlon. So how do you train based on heart rate? Well, I should preface something. What we do is we give them goals, but the heart rate does not dictate the workout. Using a heart rate monitor monitors the workout. It gives you feedback of what zones they're in. It doesn't need to dictate it. And that's an important distinction. But as far as giving them goals as far as what to shoot for, you can base it a couple different ways. One is training based on your maximum heart rate. Okay, that's kind of the traditional way that most people have done it over the years. So they might say that, I want you training at 70% of your maximum heart rate or 70 to 80% of your maximum heart rate. Well, how do you find a person's maximum heart rate? Well, ideally, they would do a maximum exertion test. Well, that's not practical for a lot of people. So traditionally what they did is they used this little formula saying 220 minus your age. The only problem with that is 220 minus your age is incredibly inaccurate. In fact, the guy who totally invented that formula basically came up with it, you'll see in your manual, on an airplane ride. And it was meant for one presentation, back in 1971. It's not very accurate, but it gives you a starting place at least, okay? It has a big range of error. It gives you a starting place if that's all you've got. The other way of doing it is basing it on what's called heart rate reserve. Remember, heart rate reserve is between resting heart rate and their maximum. That's where their heart rate's always going to be, is a percent of their heart rate reserves. This could be slightly different than heart rate max, and it does customize it a little bit more for the individual because it's not just based on their age, 220 minus their age, but also based on their resting heart rate. And that's done through something called the Carbonin formula, which we'll go over more in program design. But that's what the Carbonin formula does, is it helps you find the training zones of their heart rate reserve. Now, for athletes, a great way to train is to train based on percentages of their anaerobic or lactate threshold. Because remember, for athletes, we're truly looking for increased performance. And performance is going to start suffering if they start building up too much lactate. But if we can actually start training around that lactate zone, that point where they're going to redline, the anaerobic or lactate threshold, if we can start training around it in little intervals around it appropriately, we can actually drive that redline level higher and higher and higher, so I can work at higher and higher intensities before I really start getting that burn going. So for athletes, training based on maximum heart rate's okay, heart rate reserve is okay, but a really neat way to train is basing around that red line level, that anaerobic threshold level. Each of these will be covered in detail in the program design modules.